The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped under Marcus Webb's boathouse door like a threat. Catherine Hendricks, president of the Lakeview Shores HOA, was demanding he vacate the waterfront property within 30 days. Her claim? The boathouse lease belonged to the Homeowners Association, not to some transient boat repairman who'd been squatting there for years. Marcus, 43 years old and a third-generation maritime engineer, read the letter twice while his coffee went cold. 6 years he'd operated his business from this boathouse. 6 years of paying rent, maintaining the property, serving the community. But Catherine Hendricks had just made the biggest miscalculation of her entitled life. Because what she didn't know was that Marcus Webb didn't just lease this boathouse. He owned the entire shoreline. Where are you from? Tell us in the comments below. And if you're loving this story, hit that like button and subscribe for more. Now, let's see exactly how this unfolded. This is a story in 3 parts. The violation that pushed a good person too far, the confrontation where power shifted completely, and the resolution where justice was finally served. The violation began with whispers at HOA meetings, evolved into threatening letters, and culminated in Catherine Hendricks attempting to seize property that wasn't hers to take. For Marcus Webb, a man who built his reputation on honest work and fair dealing, watching this woman manufacture authority out of thin air tested every ounce of his patience. The sleepless nights, the legal research, the mounting pressure from neighbors who believed her lies, all of it pushed Marcus toward a breaking point where he had to decide whether to abandon everything he built or stand his ground against someone who wielded neighborhood politics like a weapon. The confrontation came during an emergency HOA meeting where Catherine planned to formally vote Marcus out of his home and business. What she got instead was a lesson in property law delivered by a man who'd spent weeks preparing for this exact moment. The revelation of who actually controlled the waterfront property didn't just shock the room. It shifted the entire power structure of Lakeview Shores permanently. The resolution brought consequences Catherine never imagined possible, transformed the HOA's leadership completely, and proved that sometimes the quietest people hold the most powerful cards. Here's exactly how it happened. Marcus Webb had inherited more than just his grandfather's skill with boats. He'd inherited his sense of place, his connection to water, and his understanding that some things matter more than money. At 43, Marcus ran Webb Maritime Services from the weathered boathouse at the eastern edge of Lakeview Shores, a private lake community 2 hours north of Seattle. The building itself was a relic from the 1940s, lovingly restored with cypress siding and a green metal roof that gleamed in the morning sun. Inside, the smell of teak oil and marine varnish mixed with coffee and old wood. This wasn't just Marcus's business. It was his home, his workshop, and his sanctuary. After his wife Sarah passed from cancer 3 years earlier, the boathouse became the place where Marcus rebuilt himself, one repaired boat at a time. The trouble started in March, subtle at first. Catherine Hendricks, 56 years old and recently elected HOA president, began appearing at community events with a leather portfolio and an air of manufactured authority. She'd moved to Lakeview Shores 18 months earlier from California, purchasing the largest home on the lake with her hedge fund manager husband's money. Within 6 months, she positioned herself as the neighborhood's self-appointed guardian, the woman who would restore proper standards to the community. Her first target was Marcus's boathouse, which she deemed an eyesore and incompatible with lakefront aesthetics. The initial complaint arrived in April, a formal HOA notice, stating that Marcus's business signage violated community guidelines. Marcus removed the sign, even though his lease explicitly permitted it. 2 weeks later, another notice complained about boat trailer parking. Marcus adjusted his client's scheduling. In May, Catherine objected to his working hours, claiming the sound of his tools disturbed residents. Marcus invested in sound dampening equipment he couldn't really afford. Each time, he complied, hoping reasonableness would prevail. Each time, Catherine found something new to attack. The escalation intensified in June when Catherine began spreading rumors at the community pool. She told neighbors that Marcus was operating an illegal business, that he was behind on rent payments, that the boathouse was structurally unsafe. None of it was true, but the whispers spread. Longtime clients started canceling appointments, avoiding eye contact when Marcus saw them at the marina. Mrs. Chun, who'd been bringing her sailboat to Marcus for 5 years, apologized quietly and said her husband thought it best to find another repair service. The isolation was deliberate and effective. July brought the breaking point. Marcus returned from a supply run to find Catherine standing on his dock with 2 HOA board members and a real estate appraiser. She was measuring his deck, photographing his building, making notes. When Marcus asked what she was doing, Catherine smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. "Just documenting HOA property," she said. "This boathouse sits on community land, Mr. Webb. We're preparing to reclaim it for proper use." The appraiser avoided Marcus's gaze. The board member shifted uncomfortably. Catherine handed Marcus a business card for a storage facility. "You'll need somewhere for your tools," she said. That night, Marcus sat in his workshop surrounded by his grandfather's old ledgers, his father's property documents, and a stack of county records he'd been too grief-stricken to examine after Sarah died. He'd been playing Catherine's game by her rules, accepting her premise that the HOA had authority over his home. But as he spread the yellowed papers across his workbench, a different story emerged, one that Catherine Hendricks had never bothered to research. Marcus worked until dawn, making phone calls, sending emails, and building a case. If Catherine wanted to weaponize property law, Marcus would show her what real property law looked like. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m. on a Thursday in mid-July, held in the community center overlooking the lake. Catherine had called it specifically to address the boathouse situation, and she made sure every resident received notice. 73 people packed the room, the largest turnout in Lakeview Shore's history. Marcus arrived 15 minutes early, carrying a weathered leather briefcase that had belonged to his grandfather. He took a seat in the back row, nodded politely to neighbors who'd stopped talking to him, and waited. Catherine began the meeting with practiced authority, wearing a cream-colored blazer and pearl earrings that caught the fluorescent lights. She projected confidence, control, and the absolute certainty of someone who'd never been challenged. After addressing routine business, she arrived at her main agenda item. "As you all know, we have a property issue that requires immediate resolution. The boathouse currently occupied by Marcus Webb sits on land that belongs to this association. Mr. Webb has been operating under an invalid lease agreement, and despite our attempts to resolve this amicably, he has refused to vacate. Tonight, we'll vote to formally terminate his occupancy and reclaim our property for community use." Marcus raised his hand. Catherine acknowledged him with visible irritation. "Yes, Mr. Webb, I'd like to present some information before any vote takes place." Marcus stood, briefcase in hand, and walked to the front of the room. His work boots were clean but worn, his flannel shirt pressed but faded. He looked like exactly what he was, a working man who'd earned everything he had. "Mrs. Hendricks claims the boathouse sits on HOA land," Marcus began, his voice steady but carrying. "She's produced no documentation supporting this claim because none exists. What does exist is a property deed recorded in 1947 when my grandfather, Thomas Webb, purchased 4 acres of waterfront land from the Lakeview Development Company. The boathouse was built that same year." Marcus opened his briefcase and removed a clear protective sleeve containing a faded document. "This is the original deed, recorded with Kitsap County, showing that Thomas Webb purchased not just the boathouse lot, but the entire eastern shoreline, including the landware. Mrs. Hendricks currently believes she has authority." The room went absolutely silent. Catherine's confident smile flickered. "That's impossible," she said. "The HOA owns all waterfront property. It's in our bylaws." Marcus pulled out a second document. These are the Lakeview Shores HOA bylaws from 1952, when the community was first incorporated. Section 4, Paragraph 2 specifically exempts the web property from association control. When the HOA formed, my grandfather refused to join. He maintained private ownership of his shoreline parcel. Marcus distributed copies to the board members. I have certified copies from the county recorder's office dated last week. The property line extends 200 feet in both directions from the boathouse. That includes the community dock, the swimming area, and half of the boat launch. Catherine's face had gone pale. Board member Robert Chun stood up, examining the document. Marcus, are you saying you own the lake access? The waterfront access, yes. My grandfather granted an easement to the HOA in 1954, allowing community use of the shore. That easement has specific terms. It can be revoked by the property owner if the HOA acts in bad faith or attempts to claim ownership of wetland. Marcus turned to Catherine. Mrs. Hendricks, you've spent 3 months trying to force me off my own property. You harassed me, spread false information, and attempted to seize assets you have no claim to. That constitutes bad faith. Catherine stood abruptly, her chair scraping the floor. This is absurd. You're a boat mechanic. You don't own. I own the shoreline, Marcus interrupted quietly. And as of this meeting, I'm formally reviewing whether to maintain the 1954 easement or revoke community water access entirely. He looked at the crowd. I don't want to do that. I've lived here my whole life, but I won't be bullied off my own land. The room erupted. Catherine tried to regain control, but Board Secretary Linda Martinez was already requesting an emergency executive session. Robert Chun was apologizing to Marcus. 3 residents were pulling out their phones to photograph the deed. Catherine Hendricks, for the first time in her carefully constructed Lakeview Shores reign, had lost complete control of the room. The emergency executive session lasted 90 minutes. Catherine refused to attend, leaving in her Mercedes with tires squealing on the gravel parking lot. The remaining board members, Robert Chun, Linda Martinez, and Treasurer David Park, sat across from Marcus in the community center's small office, documents spread across the table. Robert spoke first, his voice heavy with apology. Marcus, we had no idea. Catherine presented us with property maps that showed HOA ownership. We should have verified. Marcus nodded, his anger tempered by exhaustion. She counted on nobody checking. Most people assume the HOA controls waterfront property in a lake community. But my grandfather was specific about maintaining independence. He'd seen too many associations become little dictatorships. Marcus paused. I don't want to revoke the easement. This community has been good to me for 43 years. But things need to change. Over the next 2 hours, they negotiated a new agreement. Marcus would maintain the 1954 easement, guaranteeing community water access. In exchange, the HOA would formally recognize his property rights, issue a public apology, and remove Catherine Hendricks from the presidency. Linda drafted the language while David ran the numbers on Marcus's requested compensation for the harassment, $5,000, to cover his sound dampening equipment and lost business. Robert called an attorney friend to review everything. By 10 p.m., they had a framework. The full HOA meeting reconvened the following Tuesday. Catherine attended, sitting in the front row with her arms crossed, her lawyer beside her, a partner from a Seattle firm who'd driven up expecting to intimidate a simple boat mechanic. Instead, he spent the meeting reviewing Marcus's documentation, his expression growing increasingly uncomfortable. When Robert Chun read the proposed settlement, including Catherine's resignation, she stood to object. Her lawyer touched her arm and whispered something that made her face go crimson. She sat back down without speaking. The vote was unanimous. 38 in favor of the settlement, 0 opposed, Catherine abstaining. The apology will be published in the community newsletter. Marcus would receive his compensation within 30 days. And Catherine Hendricks would step down immediately, replaced by an interim president until the next election. But the consequences went deeper than a simple resignation. 2 days after the meeting, Marcus received a visitor at the Boathouse Detective Sarah Morrison from the county sheriff's office. Catherine had filed a complaint claiming Marcus had forged the property documents. Detective Morrison spent 3 hours reviewing Marcus's deed, comparing it to county records, examining the chain of title. She concluded her investigation on the spot. The documents were authentic. The complaint was frivolous. And she'd be noting in her report that Catherine had wasted law enforcement resources with a false accusation. Marcus learned later that the detective had grown up sailing on the lake and remembered his grandfather teaching kids maritime safety in the 1980s. The Lakeview Shores community underwent a quiet transformation. Mrs. Chen returned as a client, sheepishly admitting she'd been pressured by Catherine. Other longtime customers followed. New residents who'd heard about the confrontation stopped by to introduce themselves and shake Marcus's hand. The community voted in Linda Martinez as the new HOA president, a retired teacher who promised common sense and basic decency in leadership. Catherine and her husband listed their house in September and moved back to California. The for sale sign appearing without warning one morning, 8 weeks after the confrontation. Marcus sat on his boathouse deck at sunset, watching sailboats drift across the lake's mirror-smooth surface. Robert Chun had stopped by earlier with a settlement check and a personal apology, admitting he'd been intimidated by Catherine's forceful personality. Marcus accepted both gracefully. The sound of children splashing at the community beach carried. Across the water, the same beach his grandfather had helped build 70 years. Earlier, Marcus had learned that some battles choose you rather than the other way around. He'd learned that documentation matters more than confidence, that truth outlasts bluster, and that communities are only as good as their willingness to stand up to bullies. And as he sat there in the fading light, watching the lake he'd known his entire life, Marcus understood something his grandfather had tried to teach him years earlier. Real power doesn't come from authority or intimidation. It comes from knowing exactly who you are and refusing to pretend otherwise. Across the country in Charleston, South Carolina, retired Navy Commander Patricia Vasquez was opening her mailbox when her neighbor's landscaping crew dumped a truckload of yard waste onto her pristine lawn. The crew chief shrugged at her protest. "Your neighbor says this is community property now." OA voted. Patricia smiled, the same calm smile that once preceded Carrier operations, and pulled out her phone to call the city planning commissioner, who happened to be her daughter. But that's a story for another time.